Literature consists of written productions, often restricted to those deemed to have artistic or intellectual value. Its Latin root literatura was used to refer to all written accounts, but intertwined with the Roman concept of cultura, learning or cultivation. Literature often uses language differently than ordinary language. Literature can be classified according to whether it is fiction or non-fiction and whether it is poetry or prose. It can be further distinguished according to major forms such as the novel, short story or drama, and works are often categorized according to historical periods or their adherence to certain aesthetic features or expectations. The concept has changed meaning over time. Nowadays it can broaden to include non-written verbal art forms, and thus it is difficult to agree on its origin, which can be paired with that of language or writing itself. Developments in print technology have allowed an ever-growing distribution and proliferation of written works, culminating in electronic literature. Definitions. There have been various attempts to define literature. Simon and Delis Ryan began their attempt to answer the question, "What is literature?" with the observation, "The quest to discover a definition for literature is a road that is much traveled, though the point of arrival, if ever reached, is seldom satisfactory." Most attempted definitions are broad and vague, and they inevitably change over time. In fact, the only thing that is certain about defining literature is that the definition will change. Concepts of what is literature change over time as well. Definitions of literature have varied over time. It is of culturally relative definition. In Western Europe prior to the 18th century, literature as a term indicated all books and writing. A more restricted sense of the term emerged during the Romantic period, in which it began to demarcate imaginative literature. Contemporary debates over what constitutes literature can be seen as returning to the older, more inclusive notion of what constitutes literature. Cultural studies, for instance, takes as its subject of analysis both popular and minority genres, in addition to canonical works. The value judgment definition of literature considers it to exclusively include writing that possesses high quality or distinction, forming part of the so-called belles lettres tradition. This is the definition used in the Encyclopaedia Britannica 11th edition when it classifies literature as the best expression of the best thought reduced to writing. However, this has the result that there is no objective definition of what constitutes literature. Anything can be literature, and anything which is universally regarded as literature has the potential to be excluded, since value judgments can change over time. The formalist definition is that the history of literature foregrounds poetic effects. It is the literariness, or poeticity, of literature that distinguishes it from ordinary speech or other kinds of writing. Jim Meyer considers this a useful characteristic in explaining the use of the term to mean published material in a particular field. As such, writing must use language according to particular standards. The problem with the formalist definition is that in order to say that literature deviates from ordinary uses of language, those uses must first be identified. This is difficult because ordinary language is an unstable category, differing according to social categories and across history. Etymologically, the term derives from Latin literatura, learning, a writing. Grammar, originally, writing formed with letters, from littera, letter. In spite of this, the term has also been applied to spoken or sung texts. Major forms. Poetry. Poetry is a form of literary art which uses aesthetic and rhythmic qualities of language to evoke meanings in addition to, or in place of, prosaic ostensible meaning. Poetry has traditionally been distinguished from prose by its being set in verse. Prose is cast in sentences. Poetry in lines. The syntax of prose is dictated by meaning, whereas that of poetry is held across meter or the visual aspects of the poem. Prior to the 19th century, poetry was commonly understood to be something set in metrical lines. Accordingly, in 1658 a definition of poetry is any kind of subject consisting of rhythm or verses. possibly as a result of Aristotle's influence. Poetry, before the 19th century, was usually less a technical designation for verse than a normative category of fictive or rhetorical art. As a form it may predate literacy, with the earliest works being composed within and sustained by an oral tradition, hence it constitutes the earliest example of literature. Prose is a form of language that possesses ordinary syntax and natural speech rather than rhythmic structure, in which regard, along with its measurement in sentences rather than lines, it differs from poetry. On the historical development of prose, Richard Graff notes that, in the case of ancient Greece, recent scholarship has emphasized the fact that formal prose was a comparatively late development and invention, properly associated with the classical period. Novel, a long fictional prose narrative. It was the form's close relation to real life that differentiated it from the chivalric romance. In most European languages the equivalent term is Roman, indicating the proximity of the forms. In English, the term emerged from the Romance languages in the late 15th century, with the meaning of news. It came to indicate something new, without a distinction between fact or fiction. Although there are many historical prototypes, so-called novels before the novel, the modern novel form emerges late in cultural history, roughly during the 18th century. Initially subject to much criticism, the novel has acquired a dominant position amongst literary forms, both popularly and critically. Novella. In purely quantitative terms, the novella exists between the novel and short story. The publisher Melville House classifies it as too short to be a novel, too long to be a short story. There is no precise definition in terms of word or page count. Literary prizes and publishing houses often have their own arbitrary limits, which vary according to their particular intentions. Summarizing the variable definitions of the novella, William Giraldi concludes, it is a form whose identity seems destined to be disputed into perpetuity. It has been suggested that the size restriction of the form produces various stylistic results, both some that are shared with the novel or short story, and others unique to the form. Short story. A dilemma in defining the short story as a literary form is how to, or whether one should, distinguish it from any short narrative, hence it also has a contested origin, variably suggested as the earliest short narratives. Early short story writers, or the clearly modern short story writers. Apart from its distinct size, various theorists have suggested that the short story has a characteristic subject matter or structure. These discussions often position the form in some relation to the novel. Drama. Drama is literature intended for performance. The form is often combined with music and dance, as in opera and musical theatre. A play is a subset of this form, referring to the written dramatic work of a playwright that is intended for performance in a theatre. It comprises chiefly dialogue between characters, and usually aims at dramatic or theatrical performance rather than at reading. A closet drama, by contrast, refers to a play written to be read rather than to be performed. Hence, it is intended that the meaning of such a work can be realized fully on the page. Nearly all drama took verse form until comparatively recently. Greek drama exemplifies the earliest form of drama of which we have substantial knowledge. Tragedy, as a dramatic genre, developed as a performance associated with religious and civic festivals, typically enacting or developing upon well-known historical or mythological themes. Tragedies generally presented very serious themes. With the advent of newer technologies, scripts written for non-stage media have been added to this form. War of the Worlds in 1938 saw the advent of literature written for radio broadcast, and many works of drama have been adapted for film or television. Conversely, television, film, and radio literature have been adapted to printed or electronic media. History. The history of literature follows closely the development of civilization. When defined exclusively as written work, ancient Egyptian literature, along with Sumerian literature, are considered the world's oldest literatures. The primary genres of the literature of ancient Egypt, didactic texts, hymns and prayers, and tales, were almost entirely written in verse, while use of poetic devices is clearly recognizable. The prosody of the verse is unknown. Different historical periods are reflected in literature. National and tribal sagas, accounts of the origin of the world and of customs, and myths which sometimes carry moral or spiritual messages predominate in the pre-urban eras. The epics of Homer, dating from the early to Middle Iron Age, and the great Indian epics of a slightly later period, have more evidence of deliberate literary authorship, surviving like the older myths through oral tradition for long periods before being written down. The roots of all our modern academic fields can be found within the pages of literature. Literature in all its forms can be seen as written records. Whether the literature itself be factual or fictional, it is still quite possible to decipher facts through things like characters' actions and words, or the author's style of writing and the intent behind the words. The plot is for more than just entertainment purposes. Within it lies information about economics, psychology, science, religions, politics, cultures, and social depth. Studying and analyzing literature becomes very important in terms of learning about our history. Through the study of past literature, we are able to learn about how society has evolved and about the societal norms during each of the different periods all throughout history. This can even help us to understand references made in more modern literature, because authors often make references to Greek mythology and other old religious texts or historical moments. Not only is there literature written on each of the aforementioned topics themselves, and how they have evolved throughout history, but we can also learn about these things in fictional works. Canto I, and expresses his opinions through his character Childe Harold. Through literature we are able to continuously uncover new information about history. It is easy to see how all academic fields have roots in literature. Information became easier to pass down from generation to generation once we began to write it down. Eventually everything was written down, from things like home remedies and cures for illness, or how to build shelter, to traditions and religious practices. From there people were able to study literature, improve on ideas, further our knowledge, and academic fields such as the medical field or trades could be started. In much the same way as the literature that we study today continue to be updated as we continue to evolve and learn more and more. As a more urban culture developed, academies provided a means of transmission for speculative and philosophical literature in early civilizations, resulting in the prevalence of literature in ancient China, ancient India, Persia and ancient Greece and Rome. Many works of earlier periods, even in narrative form, had a covert moral or didactic purpose, such as the Sanskrit Panchatantra or the Metamorphoses of Ovid. Drama and satire also developed as urban culture provided a larger public audience, and later readership, for literary production. Lyric poetry was often the speciality of courts and aristocratic circles, particularly in East Asia, where songs were collected by the Chinese aristocracy as poems, the most notable being the Shijing or Book of Songs. Over a long period, the poetry of popular pre-literate balladry and song interpenetrated and eventually influenced poetry in the literary medium. In ancient China, early literature was primarily focused on philosophy, historiography, military science, agriculture, and poetry. China, the origin of modern paper making and woodblock printing, produced one of the world's first print cultures. Much of Chinese literature originates with the Hundred Schools of Thought period that occurred during the Eastern Zhou dynasty. The most important of these include the classics of Confucianism, of Daoism, of Mohism, of legalism, as well as works of military science and Chinese history. Ancient Chinese literature had a heavy emphasis on historiography, with often very detailed court records. An exemplary piece of narrative history of ancient China was the Zhaojuan, which was compiled no later than 389 BCE, and attributed to the blind 5th century BCE historian Zhao Qiming. In ancient India, literature originated from stories that were originally orally transmitted. Early genres included drama, fables, sutras and epic poetry. Sanskrit literature begins with the Vedas, dating back to 1500 to 1000 BCE, and continues with the Sanskrit epics of Iron Age India. The Vedas are among the oldest sacred texts. The Samhitas date to roughly 1500 to 1000 BCE, and the Circumvedic texts, as well as the redaction of the Samhitas, date to c. 1000 to 500 BCE, resulting in a Vedic period, spanning the mid-2nd to mid-1st millennium BCE, or the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. The period between approximately the 6th to 1st centuries BC saw the composition and redaction of the two most influential Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, with subsequent redaction progressing down to the 4th century AD. In ancient Greece, the epics of Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Hesiod, who wrote works and Days and Theogony, are some of the earliest, and most influential, of ancient Greek literature. Classical Greek genres included philosophy, poetry, historiography, comedies and dramas. Plato and Aristotle authored philosophical texts that are the foundation of Western philosophy. Sappho and Pindar were influential lyric poets, and Herodotus and Thucydides were early Greek historians. Although drama was popular in ancient Greece, of the hundreds of tragedies written and performed during the classical age, only a limited number of plays by 3 authors still exist: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The plays of Aristophanes provide the only real examples of a genre of comic drama known as Old Comedy, the earliest form of Greek comedy, and are in fact used to define the genre. Roman histories and biographies anticipated the extensive medieval literature of lives of saints and miraculous chronicles. But the most characteristic form of the Middle Ages was the Romance, an adventurous and sometimes magical narrative with strong popular appeal. Controversial, religious, political and instructional literature proliferated during the Renaissance as a result of the invention of printing, while the medieval romance developed into a more character-based and psychological form of narrative, the novel, of which early and important examples are the Chinese Monkey and the German Faust books. In the Age of Reason, philosophical tracts and speculations on history and human nature integrated literature with social and political developments. The inevitable reaction was the explosion of Romanticism in the later 18th century, which reclaimed the imaginative and fantastical bias of old Romanticism folk literature and asserted the primacy of individual experience and emotion. But as the 19th century went on, European fiction evolved towards realism and naturalism, the meticulous documentation of real life and social trends. Much of the output of naturalism was implicitly polemical, and influenced social and political change. But 20th century fiction and drama moved back towards the subjective, emphasizing unconscious motivations and social and environmental pressures on the individual. Writers such as Proust, Eliot, Joyce, Kafka and Pirandello exemplify the trend of documenting internal rather than external realities. Genre fiction also showed it could question reality in its 20th century forms, in spite of its fixed formulas. Through the inquiries of the skeptical detective and the alternative realities of science fiction, the separation of mainstream and genre forms continued to blur during the period up to our own times. William Burroughs, in his early works, and Hunter S. Thompson expanded documentary reporting into strong subjective statements after the Second World War, and postmodern critics have disparaged the idea of objective realism in general. Awards. There are numerous awards recognizing achievement and contribution in literature. Given the diversity of the field, awards are typically limited in scope, usually on form, genre, language, nationality and output. The Nobel Prize in Literature was one of the 5 Nobel Prizes established by the rule of Alfred Nobel in 1895, and is awarded to an author on the basis of their body of work, rather than to, or for, a particular work itself. Other literary prizes for which all nationalities are eligible include the Neustadt International Prize for Literature, the Man Booker International Prize and the Franz Kafka Prize. Essays. Genres related to the essay may include the memoir and the epistle.